Millionaire catches Nanny dancing with his son in a wheelchair, and what he saw shocked Haim for months. The boy hadn't moved a muscle, trapped in his own body and forgotten by everyone until a camera revealed the impossible. On the screen, the nanny danced alone, silently, with the boy in his wheelchair, and he seemed to respond. A slight movement, a spark in his eyes, a tear no one ever believed he could shed. In that moment, the father realized that the cure he tried to buy with millions was right there, in the affection he himself never had the courage to give.
The Sinclair mansion stood imposing atop a hill in Highland Falls, in the Adirondacks, isolated among pine trees and surrounded by a constant mist that seemed to materialize the emptiness dwelling within. Its stone walls and large bay windows, which had once witnessed parties and laughter, now held only the echo of hurried footsteps and the clinical whisper of monitoring machines. Gregory Sinclair, one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the New York real estate sector, walked the mansion's corridors with the same calculated precision he used to analyze his million-dollar contracts. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, even at home on a Sunday morning. For him, weekends had ceased to exist since the accident in Eagles Pass on the Northway, which had taken his wife Marianne and transformed his only son, Peter, into a silent presence, confined to a wheelchair and a mutism that no specialist had managed to break. In the mansion's east wing, converted into a mini rehabilitation clinic, 12-year-old Peter remained motionless before the window. His fixed gaze seemed to pierce through the Adirondack Mountains, searching for something far beyond the visible horizon. Paralyzed from the neck down after the accident, the boy had not spoken a word in almost 2 years. The doctors spoke of deep psychological trauma, an emotional barrier the young man had built to protect himself from the pain of loss and a guilt that should not have been his. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett. Any progress in the weekly report?" Gregory asked the neurologist who was leaving Peter's room, without even glancing into the space where his son remained. "Mr. Sinclair, his vital signs are stable, but we're still seeing no response to advanced cognitive stimuli," the doctor replied, handing over a folder with graphs and meticulous notes. "Perhaps it's time we consider an alternative approach, as suggested by Dr. Owens." Gregory furrowed his brow. Alternatives meant uncertainties, and uncertainties were not part of the vocabulary he had used to rebuild his life after everything had fallen apart. "We will discuss that at the team meeting on Wednesday. For now, maintain the current protocol." Mrs. Marlene, the housekeeper who managed the mansion with the same rigidity Gregory imposed on his businesses, approached with firm steps along the marble hallway. "Sir, the new caregiver has arrived. She's waiting in the study as you requested." "Already? Wasn't she scheduled to arrive tomorrow?" "She said she preferred to come today to get acquainted with the boy's routine before officially taking over. I questioned this unauthorized early arrival, but she insisted it was part of her working method." The entrepreneur adjusted his tie in an automatic gesture. Method? She wasn't hired to have her own methods, but to follow our protocols. As he walked toward the study, Gregory tried to ignore the unease he felt. After the sudden departure of the last nurse, the agency in New York City had recommended this professional as someone with exceptional experience in complex cases, but experience to Gregory simply meant discipline in executing the procedures established by the specialists he had hired. In the large study, paneled in dark wood and lined with books no one read anymore, a woman of about 30 was looking out the window. Unlike the professionals who usually moved through the mansion, she wore no white uniform or carried clipboards with notes. She was dressed in simple jeans, a light blue blouse, and had her curly hair tied up in an unpretentious bun. "Miss..." Gregory left the question hanging in the air, remaining near the door. "Louise Clark." She turned with a serene smile and eyes that seemed to truly see the person in front of her. "Thank you for seeing me ahead of schedule, Mr. Sinclair." "Actually, we did not arrange for your early arrival," he replied without extending his hand. "And I must say, starting a job by disregarding established schedules does not set a good precedent." Instead of apologizing, Louise held his gaze steady. "I understand your concern for procedures, sir. But I believe the care for your son doesn't begin with my clock-in time, but with my ability to understand and respond to the environment he lives in. 2 years is a long time to be in silence." The direct mention of Peter's state caused visible discomfort in Gregory. Few referred to the boy's condition so directly in his presence. "I assume you've read the contract and the protocols established by the medical team," he deflected, indicating a folder on the desk. "I've read all the technical reports, yes." Louise approached the desk but did not sit down. "There are 18 different diagnoses, 26 therapeutic approaches attempted, and none that have looked at Peter beyond his clinical condition. I saw a lot of numbers, Mr. Sinclair, but very little about who your son is." Gregory felt his face flush with an irritation he hadn't shown in a long time. "My team is composed of the best specialists in the country. What exactly are you insinuating, Miss Clark?" "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm stating it directly. I know you've hired the best technicians, but perhaps Peter doesn't just need technique right now." She paused and softened her voice. "Before I see your son, I'd like to ask, what was his favorite song? What made him laugh before the accident?" The silence that followed was as dense as the one that inhabited Peter's room. Gregory opened his mouth and closed it again. For a moment it seemed as if something had cracked in his perfect composure. That is not in the care protocols," he finally answered, his voice slightly lower. "Exactly, Mr. Sinclair. And perhaps that's why we are still where we are." Louise picked up a small backpack she had left beside the armchair. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to meet Peter now. Just to introduce myself, nothing more." Gregory hesitated, his analytical mind trying to process this approach that completely deviated from what he had established as the standard in his home. After a moment, he gave a curt nod. "Mrs. Marlene will accompany you. I have a video conference in 5 minutes." He turned to his desk, a clear dismissal of the conversation. "And Miss Clark?" "Yes?" "I expect a detailed report at the end of each day. This house runs on order and method, not well-intentioned improvisations." When Louise left the study, she didn't notice that Gregory didn't immediately return to his documents. Instead, he stared at a locked drawer in his desk, where he kept the last photo he had taken with Marianne and Peter 3 days before the accident that destroyed everything he had considered unshakable in his life. In the hallway, Mrs. Marlene led Louise with rigid steps and lips pressed tight in silent disapproval. "The medication schedule is on the board next to the bed. Passive exercises are performed at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Dr. Bennett left specific instructions regarding the limits of sensory stimulation," the housekeeper recited. "How long have you worked for the family, Mrs. Marlene?" Louise interrupted. The question took the woman by surprise. 15 years, since before the boy was born." "So you knew Peter when he still talked?" "Played?" Something flickered in the housekeeper's severe expression, but she quickly composed herself. "That is not relevant to your duties, miss. What's important is to follow what has been established by the specialists." They stopped before a plain white door that could easily be mistaken for the entrance to a doctor's office. Mrs. Marlene knocked lightly before opening it. "Peter, this is the new caregiver, Miss Louise. She will be looking after you from today." The room, though spacious and equipped with state-of-the-art technology, felt strangely empty. The neutral-toned walls had no posters or photos. The medical equipment, though discreetly positioned, dominated the space. Near the window in a custom wheelchair was Peter. The boy did not move when they entered. His eyes, a deep brown like his mother's, remained fixed on the landscape outside. His thin body seemed too small for his 12 years, a consequence of prolonged immobility despite all the physical therapy. "I'll leave you now. The intercom is next to the bed if you need anything," Mrs. Marlene said, already leaving. "And remember, no excessive stimulation. The last medical report recommended caution." When the door closed, Louise set her backpack on the floor and slowly approached. The boy, not as a professional analyzing a patient, but as someone meeting a person for the first time. She knelt to be at his eye level. "Hi, Peter. My name is Louise. I'm not exactly a nurse, you know. Actually, before I worked with kids like you, I used to tell stories. I still do, in fact. Her voice was calm, without the artificial tone many adults use with children or patients. "I didn't come here today to do any tests or exercises. I just wanted to meet you." Peter remained motionless, his gaze seemingly lost beyond the window. But something almost imperceptible happened. His breathing, previously perfectly rhythmic, slightly altered. To anyone else, it would have been just a casual, deeper breath. To Louise, it was the first thread of a silent conversation that was just beginning. In his study, Gregory adjusted the security cameras for Peter's room on his computer. He did not trust unconventional methods, much less people who arrived early and questioned established protocols. He would watch this new caregiver's every move. Over the first week, Louise established a different routine in the Sinclair mansion. She strictly adhered to the prescribed medication and exercise schedules, but in the intervals between clinical procedures, she brought something that room hadn't known for a long time: life. On Wednesday morning, as the Highland Falls mist embraced the mansion, she entered Peter's room, carrying a small speaker and a brightly colored book. "Good morning, Peter. I brought something you might like," she said naturally, as if talking to any teenager. Without waiting for a response, she placed the speaker near the boy's chair and played a soft guitar melody. The music chosen was neither childish nor classical, as previous therapists had insisted. It was a popular American folk song, the kind that played on the radio when Peter was still running through the mansion's gardens. Louise had discovered, through careful conversations with the estate's oldest gardener, that the boy liked folk music, an influence from Marianne, who had dreamed of seeing her son learn the guitar. "Mr. Henderson told me that you and your mother used to dance on the porch when this song played," Louise commented as she adjusted the volume. She had good taste. For an instant so brief that any casual observer would miss it, Peter's pupils contracted. It wasn't a deliberate movement, but an autonomous response to a reawakened memory. In the monitoring system in his study, Gregory froze as he noticed that micro-movement. For months, technical reports had measured physical responses without perceiving what a simple song had provoked in seconds. His fingers drummed on the desk, torn between irritation at the breach of protocol and a reluctant curiosity. Meanwhile, Mrs. Marlene was passing through the hallway and stopped upon hearing the music coming from Peter's room. Her face hardened in disapproval. She entered without knocking, interrupting the moment. "What is going on in here? Music is not on the protocol for this time." Louise showed no surprise or guilt. "Good morning, Mrs. Marlene. I'm just providing a different auditory stimulus within the recommended intensity limits. There is a specific stimulation schedule developed by Dr. Bennett. This," she pointed to the speaker, "was not authorized." "Actually," Louise replied calmly, showing her a folder, "the protocol mentions varied auditory stimuli at moderate intensity. It doesn't specify which sounds. I am simply adapting it to Peter's historical preference." Mrs. Marlene opened her mouth to argue, but realized that technically Louise was correct. "Mr. Sinclair will be informed of this creative interpretation of the procedures," she said, before leaving, closing the door with more force than necessary. Louise turned her attention back to Peter. "She worries about you, you know. In her own way, of course." She sat beside him and opened the book. "Now, how about a different story? Enough clinical reports for today." In the following days, small changes began to appear in the mansion's routine. Louise left the curtains wide open, allowing natural light to flood the room. Instead of always keeping Peter in the same position, she subtly changed the angle of his chair several times a day, offering him different views of the garden. She placed small plants in the room, introduced the scents of fresh herbs, and read stories with dramatic intonation. At the end of the first week, when she thought no one was watching, she took Peter out onto the porch for the first time in months. "The doctor said too much sun isn't recommended," commented Raphael, one of the nurses assisting with his care. "The doctor said prolonged sun exposure," Louise corrected as she adjusted the blanket on Peter's legs. 15 minutes in the morning isn't prolonged, and natural vitamin D is good for the bones." Raphael hesitated, glancing at the discreetly positioned cameras. "Mr. Sinclair won't like this." "If he questions it, I'll take full responsibility," Louise replied firmly. "But I don't think he'll question results." What no one expected was that on the porch, where the scent of pine mixed with that of garden flowers, Peter deliberately moved his eyes, following the flight of a hummingbird that had come near. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, but it was real and conscious. Raphael's eyes widened. "Did you see that?" "I did," Louise smiled, without showing excessive surprise. "And this is just the beginning." In the mansion's meeting room, the medical team discussed Peter's case as they did weekly. Gregory presided over the meeting with his usual impassive expression, but internally he was divided. He had observed through the cameras the small moments that his expensive team seemed to miss. Physiological parameters remained stable, with no significant changes, reported Dr. Bennett, projecting graphs onto the screen. "I recommend maintaining the current protocol of neuromuscular stimulation." Mrs. Marlene, who usually only served coffee at these meetings, cleared her throat discreetly. "Excuse me, doctor, but perhaps we should discuss the adaptations the new caregiver has been making to the procedures," the doctor frowned. "Adaptations? I was not consulted about any changes to the protocol." "Technically, sir," intervened Dr. Owens, the physical therapist, "she hasn't altered the medical procedures. She has only introduced complementary elements in the intervals between therapies. Music, stories, changes in the chair's position to vary the visual field. And unauthorized outdoor exposure," Mrs. Marlene added. "She took the boy to the porch yesterday, without medical supervision." Gregory, who had been silent until then, leaned forward. "Was there any physical harm from this exposure?" "No, but were there any negative changes in his vital signs or neurological responses?" "We detected none, but the procedure was not—" "And results," Gregory interrupted again. "Have any of you noticed any different reactions in the last 2 weeks?" An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Dr. Owens adjusted her glasses. "The quantitative data show no statistically significant changes, Mr. Sinclair." "But," Gregory prodded. The therapist hesitated. "The nurse, Raphael, reported that the patient seemed to exhibit voluntary eye movement during the outdoor exposure. We couldn't confirm it on the monitors, so I considered it anecdotal data, not scientific." Gregory stood up and walked to the window, his back to the team. 2 years, he said finally. 2 years of scientific data and impeccable procedures. And in 2 weeks, this caregiver gets what you call anecdotal data. "Mr. Sinclair," Dr. Bennett tried, "we must be cautious with unverified observations. Family members and caregivers often project desired reactions onto patients with conditions like Peter's." "I saw the reaction on the cameras, doctor," Gregory replied without turning around. "It wasn't projection. It was my son following a bird with his eyes." The revelation silenced the room. Mrs. Marlene adjusted her pearl necklace, visibly uncomfortable. "You didn't mention this before, sir?" "Because I wanted to hear your assessment first," Gregory answered, finally facing the group. "Continue the monitoring, but from now on, Miss Clark will have the autonomy to supplement the treatment with her approaches, as long as they do not compromise Peter's physical safety." As the team filed out, Mrs. Marlene remained, waiting for everyone to leave before approaching Gregory. "Sir, I apologize for the indiscretion, but I've known Peter since he was born. I've cared for this house and this family for 15 years. I don't think it's wise to give a newcomer with unconventional ideas so much freedom." Gregory looked at her for a moment. In any other context, he would have valued the housekeeper's loyalty and caution. But something had changed. "Your concern is understandable, Marlene, but I have to be pragmatic. 2 years of conventional methods have not brought my son back. If there's a chance, however small—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes held something Marlene hadn't seen since the accident, a faint glimmer of hope. In Peter's room, oblivious to the meeting and its conclusions, Louise was reading a story about a journey to the center of the earth. She didn't use the patronizing voice many adults reserve for children, nor the clinical tone of the therapists. She read as if sharing an adventure with a friend. "This was one of my favorite books when I was your age," she commented, turning a page. "I always imagined what it would be like to descend to the center of the planet." Peter remained still, but his breathing had a different rhythm when Louise was present. more relaxed, more natural. Any casual observer wouldn't notice, but for someone trained in non-verbal language like Louise, it was as if the boy was, in his own silent way, actively participating in that moment. On the security system, Gregory watched the scene. For the first time in a long time, he didn't activate the sound to monitor procedures or check compliance with protocols. He just watched his son and the woman who, inexplicably, seemed to have found a way to reach him when all the specialists had failed. That night, when the mansion fell silent and only the occasional sound of monitoring devices remained, Gregory did something he hadn't done in almost 2 years. He entered his son's room while he slept, not to check equipment or consult data, but simply to look at Peter. In the dim light, he observed the boy's face so much like Marianne's. For a fleeting moment, he allowed his hand to lightly touch his son's hair, a simple human gesture that had become foreign to him. "What is this woman doing to us, son?" he whispered, more to himself than to Peter. October arrived in the Adirondacks with sunnier mornings and pleasantly warm afternoons. The routine of the Sinclair mansion had subtly transformed over the past 3 weeks. The once silent corridors now occasionally echoed with music coming from Peter's room. Some staff members who used to hurry through their duties and leave now lingered a little longer, exchanging a few words with Louise or simply observing the small changes spreading throughout the property. Raphael, the nurse who had once hesitated at Louise's initiatives, was now her main ally. That Thursday morning, he was helping prepare Peter for a sunbath in the mansion's conservatory. "The temperature is perfect today," he commented, while adjusting the IV stand. "Do you think we can stay out longer?" 20 minutes, no more," Louise replied, checking the boy's vital signs. "We'll respect his body's limits." The conservatory was a small oasis that Gregory had built when Marianne was pregnant. Protected by a glass structure, it allowed one to enjoy the sun even on the coldest mountain days. Roses, hydrangeas, and bromeliads created a colorful and fragrant environment that had rarely seen visitors since the accident. "Your father planned every inch of this garden," Louise told Peter, as she positioned him where the morning light was softest. "Mr. Henderson told me your mother wanted you to grow up knowing every plant, every flower." Peter kept his gaze seemingly vacant, but Louise and Raphael had learned to notice the subtle indicators of his attention, an almost imperceptible change in his breathing rhythm, a slight, very slight, contraction of his pupils when something captured his interest. At the entrance to the conservatory, Mrs. Marlene watched the scene with a closed expression. Since the meeting where Gregory had granted Louise more autonomy, the housekeeper had intensified her surveillance. She meticulously noted every deviation from the original protocols, every extra minute in the garden, every unauthorized song played in the boy's room. 20 minutes, Miss Clark," she reminded in a firm voice. "Dr. Bennett was very clear about the exposure limits." "We're timing it, Mrs. Marlene," Louise answered without showing any annoyance, "and we are constantly monitoring his vital signs, as established." The housekeeper nodded curtly before leaving, not without casting a disapproving glance at Raphael, as if considering him a traitor for supporting the new approaches. "She doesn't give up, does she?" the nurse commented in a low voice. "She's doing what she believes is best for Peter," Louise replied, as she tucked a stray lock of hair from the boy's eyes. In her own way, with the tools she knows, on the upper floor of the mansion, Gregory Sinclair was in his private study, a room few were permitted to enter. Unlike the main office where he received the medical team and conducted video conferences, this was a more personal space, though equally organized. On his desk, an open folder contained the latest reports on Peter's condition. Beside it, his laptop displayed live footage from the conservatory, where he could see his son, Louise, and Raphael. He watched the scene without interfering, as he had been doing for the past few weeks. A discreet knock on the door interrupted his observation. "Come in," he ordered, quickly closing the folder. Mrs. Marlene entered with a tray of coffee. "I thought you might like some coffee before your 11 o'clock video conference, sir." "Thank you, Marlene," Gregory replied, sensing that the tray was just an excuse for the housekeeper's true intention. "Mr. Sinclair," she began after placing the tray on a side table, "I'm concerned about the direction Peter's treatment is taking. Gregory indicated a chair. "Sit down, Marlene. You've been in this house long enough to speak openly with me." The housekeeper smoothed her impeccable uniform before sitting on the edge of the chair. "That's precisely why, sir. Because I've known this family for so long, I'm worried by what I see. This young woman, Miss Clark, is creating an emotional dependency in the boy, introducing elements that haven't been scientifically validated." "Like music, sunshine, stories?" Gregory questioned with a raised eyebrow. "Like false hope," Marlene answered firmly. "You've been watching the cameras. You know the movements are minimal, possibly involuntary. The doctors have already explained that cases like Peter's often present reflexes that can be mistaken for conscious responses." Gregory rolled a pen between his fingers, a habit from when he needed to organize complex thoughts. "You think Louise is exaggerating his reactions?" "Not deliberately, sir. I believe she is well-intentioned. But people like her, who work based on emotions and not science, often see what they wish to see." Marlene took a strategic pause. "And they make others see it too." The insinuation hung in the air. Gregory stood up and walked to the window, from where he could see the Adirondack Mountains partially shrouded in mist. "Have you ever considered, Marlene, that perhaps science doesn't have all the answers?" The housekeeper seemed genuinely surprised. In 15 years, she had never heard her employer question data or scientific methodologies. Since Marianne's passing, Gregory had clung to reports, evidence, and protocols like a life raft. "You are a rational man," she replied cautiously. "You have always based your decisions on proven facts, not on intuitions or feelings." "And where has that gotten us in the last 2 years?" The question came out more bitter than Gregory had intended. He turned to face the housekeeper. 2 years of impeccable science, and my son is still trapped inside himself." Marlene stood up, approaching with the familiarity of someone who had witnessed the family's most difficult moments. "Sir, I understand your frustration. We all want Peter to get better, but we can't let ourselves be carried away by small signs that may mean nothing." Gregory nodded slowly. "You're right, Marlene. We need to be realistic." A pause. "Continue to observe and report to me. I want to know everything that happens when I'm not present." The housekeeper seemed relieved to receive confirmation that her surveillance had official approval. "Always, sir, for the boy's own good." When Marlene left, Gregory returned to watching the footage from the conservatory. Peter had been repositioned under a flowering tree, and Louise seemed to be telling a story, gesturing gently. Even without the sound on, there was something almost hypnotic about the scene, a sense of normalcy his house hadn't known for a long time. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the only one he kept locked. From inside, he took out a carved wooden box, a gift from Marianne on their last anniversary together. With a click, the lid opened to reveal a small digital storage device. Nearly 2 years ago, Gregory had stored all the family's digital memories there, photos, videos, voice recordings, memories that had become too painful to keep in sight but impossible to delete. He rarely found the courage to revisit them, but today something compelled him. He connected the device to his computer and opened a folder simply labeled Peter, 10 years old. The screen filled with video thumbnails, each representing a moment frozen in time. Peter blowing out birthday candles, running through the same garden where he now sat motionless, playing the first notes on the guitar his mother had given him. He clicked on a random file. The image of Peter appeared, laughing as he tried to balance on a new bicycle, with Marianne running alongside, holding the seat, to steady him. His wife's voice came through clearly. "You can do it, my love. Mommy's right here." Gregory closed his eyes, letting Marianne's voice fill the study. When he opened them again, another video caught his attention, a recording from the hospital made 2 days after the accident. He hesitated, the cursor hovering over the file. In 2 years, he had never had the courage to watch those last interactions before Peter completely shut down. With a determined click, he opened the file. The shaky image showed Peter in the hospital bed, already motionless but still conscious. A younger, visibly devastated version of Gregory appeared at the edge of the frame, clearly uncomfortable being filmed in that vulnerable moment. "We're recording to track his progress," a doctor's voice explained from off-camera. Try to talk to him normally, Mr. Sinclair. The Gregory in the video mechanically approached the bed. Hi, son. The doctors are taking good care of you. We'll be home soon. Peter's eyes in that recording still had life in them. They moved toward his father, focused, attentive. His hand, still with some residual mobility in those first few days, made a minimal movement toward Gregory, a silent plea for contact, for comfort. In the video, Gregory looked at his son's hand but didn't touch it. Instead, he turned to the doctor. How long until we can transfer him home? I'm already preparing a suitable setup. Peter's gaze changed in that moment. Something slowly extinguished as his father spoke of equipment, specialists and treatments, never returning to the contact the boy had sought. Gregory paused the video, the image frozen on the exact moment his son's eyes began to lose focus, turning toward the void that would become his refuge for the next 2 years. My God, he whispered to the empty study. I did this. The realization fell upon him like a physical weight. It wasn't just the accident that had stolen Peter from the world. It was also his own response, his inability to offer what his son needed most at that moment. Not an efficient crisis manager, but simply a present father. In the garden, the sun exposure time was over. Raphael was carefully pushing Peter's chair back inside the mansion, with Louise walking alongside, still talking quietly to the boy about the flowers they had observed. As they turned down the corridor toward his room, they came face to face with Gregory, who rarely circulated in that wing during the day. Mr. Sinclair, Raphael greeted with surprise, we were just returning from the conservatory. The exposure time was respected, as per the protocol. Gregory barely registered the nurse's words. His eyes were fixed on Peter, as if seeing him truly for the first time since the accident. Sir? Louise noticed the intensity of his gaze. Is everything all right? Yes, Gregory replied automatically, then hesitated. No. Actually, it's not. He approached Peter's chair and, to the astonishment of Raphael and Louise, knelt down to be at his son's eye level. Hi, Peter, it's me, your dad. Raphael shot a confused look at Louise, who made a discreet gesture for him not to interfere. Gregory remained there, looking at his son in a way he hadn't in a long time, not as a patient or a project, but as his boy. Can I walk with you to his room? He finally asked, his voice strangely hesitant for a man known for his assertiveness. Of course, Louise replied naturally, as if there were nothing extraordinary about the request. We were thinking of putting on some music, before lunch. Perhaps you'd like to suggest something? Gregory straightened up, regaining some of his usual composure. I don't know what he'd like to hear now. That's okay, Louise smiled softly. We can find out together. In the weeks that followed, a subtle transformation permeated the Sinclair mansion. Gregory, once a distant presence who manifested mainly through reports and video conferences, now appeared in Peter's room at unexpected times. He didn't interfere directly with the care or procedures, just observed, sometimes asked questions, and occasionally, when he thought no one was paying attention, touched his son's hand with a hesitant gesture, like someone testing the temperature of unknown water. Mrs. Marlene watched these changes with growing apprehension. On a particularly cold November morning, while supervising the cleaning of the mansion's east wing, she found Gregory sitting alone in Peter's room, reading a book of adventures aloud. The boy was seemingly asleep, but his father continued reading as if he could be heard even in sleep. Mr. Sinclair, she interrupted, with a light knock on the door. Dr. Bennett has arrived for the bi-weekly assessment. He's waiting in the consulting room. Gregory carefully marked the page before closing the book. Thank you, Marlene. I'll be there in a moment. The housekeeper hesitated at the door, her face revealing a genuine concern. Sir, if I may, is everything all right? You've been different these past few weeks. Different how, Marlene? Gregory asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. More, she searched for the right word, present, which is good, of course, she added quickly. But I worry you're building expectations that may not be met. Dr. Bennett still maintains a guarded prognosis, and Miss Clark, despite her good intentions, might be encouraging hopes. Unfounded hopes? Gregory completed, a faint, ironic smile on his lips. That's what you mean, isn't it? That I'm deluding myself? I'm just worried about you, Marlene replied sincerely. Seeing you suffer again, if there's no real progress, would be very difficult for all of us. Gregory stood up, placing the book on the nightstand. He looked at Peter for a moment before turning to the housekeeper. Do you know what my biggest mistake was, Marlene? Believing I could manage pain the way I manage my business. I turned my son into a project, my home into a hospital, and I lost 2 years that will never come back. He adjusted Peter's blanket in a protective gesture. I don't know what will happen from now on, but I know I can't make the same mistake again. As he walked down the hall toward the makeshift consulting room, Gregory reflected on the changes of the past few weeks. Peter's small signs of progress, an eye movement here, a change in breathing there, were still insufficient to excite the medical team, but they had awakened something in him he thought was dead. Hope. Dr. Bennett awaited him with a neutral expression, typical of doctors trained not to reveal prognoses. Ahead of time. Mr. Sinclair, thank you for coming. I was just reviewing the latest monitoring reports. And what do they say? Gregory asked, sitting down across from the doctor. Well, the physical parameters remain stable. The musculature is responding well to passive exercises, which is positive for preventing further atrophy. As for brain activity... The doctor hesitated, readjusting his glasses. There are some subtle changes at certain times of the day, especially during the sessions with Miss Clark, but nothing that can be classified as a consistent pattern of conscious response. Nothing? Gregory questioned. The eye movements, the changes, in his breathing? They could be autonomic reflexes, the doctor explained patiently. In cases like Peter's, it's common for the brain to still process sensory stimuli at a basic level, generating small physical responses that seem intentional but may not represent full consciousness. Gregory absorbed the information in silence. Before, he would have accepted the scientific explanation without question. Now, something inside him resisted. Doctor, when you speak to Peter, how do you address him? The question took the doctor by surprise. Wait, what do you mean? Do you speak directly to him, or do you talk about him as if he weren't present? Dr. Bennett seemed uncomfortable. Well, I naturally maintain professional communication, explaining procedures before performing them, but you don't really expect him to understand, Gregory finished. You speak to him the same way you would speak to a piece of equipment that needs to be operated. Isn't that right? Mr. Sinclair, I understand your frustration, but I must be realistic about your son's condition. Science tells us that... Science is always evolving, isn't it, Doctor? What was impossible yesterday becomes possible today. The doctor sighed, removing his glasses to clean them, a gesture Gregory recognized as a technique, to buy time. Look, the doctor began in a conciliatory tone, I'm not saying there's no hope, just that we need to base our expectations on concrete evidence. Miss Clark's approaches, while beneficial for his general well-being, have not fundamentally altered the neurological diagnosis. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. Raphael, the nurse, entered with a worried expression. Sorry to interrupt. Dr. Bennett, we need you in Peter's room. He's running a high temperature and his vitals are changing. The two men hurried down the hall. In the room they found Louise placing cool compresses on Peter's forehead. His normally pale face was now blotchy and red. A monitor beside the bed was emitting intermittent alerts. It started about 20 minutes ago, Louise explained to the doctor. First I noticed his skin was hot, then his heart rate increased. Dr. Bennett quickly took charge, checking vital signs and examining the patient with mechanical efficiency. A fever of 102.5 degree Kelvin. It could be a respiratory or urinary infection, common in bedridden patients. We'll start a broad-spectrum antibiotic while we wait for the test results. As the doctor gave orders, Gregory watched his son with growing anguish. Peter seemed even more vulnerable now, small and frail under the clinical light of the room. Is this serious? He asked no one in particular. Patients in Peter's condition have compromised immune systems due to prolonged immobility. Dr. Bennett explained without stopping his procedures. Infections are recurrent and need to be treated aggressively. But will he be okay? Something in Gregory's voice, an almost imperceptible tremor of fear, made Louise look at him attentively. For the first time she saw not the calculating businessman or the distant father, but simply a man terrified by the possibility of losing his son. "We'll do everything necessary," she answered, before the doctor could offer a cold statistic. "I'll stay with him all night." The hours that followed transformed the methodical routine of the mansion into a tense coming and going of professionals. Samples were collected, intravenous medications were connected, additional monitors were installed. Amid the organized chaos, Gregory remained in a corner of the room, watching everything with eyes that could not hide his panic. When night fell, and the medical team was reduced to the night shift, Louise found Gregory still in the same spot, now sitting in an armchair beside his son's bed. "You should get some rest," she suggested, offering him a cup of coffee. "I can call you immediately if there's any change." "I'm staying," he replied simply, accepting the coffee without taking his eyes off Peter. "I've wasted too much time already." During that long night, as Peter's fever fluctuated and the antibiotics began their silent work, something definitively changed between Gregory and Louise. They didn't exchange many words, but they shared a vigil that established a mutual understanding deeper than any conversation. Hour after hour, Louise checked vital signs, adjusted medications, changed compresses. From his corner, Gregory watched not only his son but also the caregiver's dedication, not as a professional fulfilling her duty, but as someone who genuinely cared. Near dawn, as the cold light began to filter through the cracks in the curtains, Peter's fever finally broke. The boy seemed to be sleeping peacefully now, his face gradually returning to its natural color. "The fever is under control," Louise reported in a low voice. "The antibiotics seem to be working." Gregory nodded, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. "Thank you for everything." "I just did my job," she replied simply. "No." He shook his head. "It's not just a job for you. It never was it?" Louise looked at the man before her, exhausted, vulnerable, more sincere than she had ever seen him. "No, it never was. Every child I care for becomes a part of my life, even if temporarily, especially those the world has given up on listening to." The words hung between them, heavy with a meaning that transcended the moment. Gregory was about to reply when Mrs. Marlene entered the room carrying a tray with breakfast. "Dr. Bennett is on his way to assess the boy," she announced with her usual efficiency. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, noticing the proximity between Gregory and Louise, the silent intimacy that had formed during the night. Something in her expression hardened. "The preliminary test results have arrived in your email, sir, as requested." "Thank you, Marlene," Gregory replied, rising with some effort after the night in the uncomfortable armchair. "I'll freshen up and review the data before the doctor arrives." When Gregory left, Marlene remained in the room, watching as Louise checked Peter's vital signs once more. "You've certainly won the boss's trust," the housekeeper commented in a seemingly casual tone. Louise continued her work without reacting to the veiled provocation. "Mr. Sinclair is just worried about his son. It's natural for him to want to be close at a time like this." "Natural," Marlene repeated, the word laden with skepticism. "Nothing has been natural in this house since you arrived, Miss Clark. Protocols broken, routines altered, expectations created." Louise finally faced the housekeeper. "What exactly bothers you, Mrs. Marlene? That I'm trying to help Peter, or that it's working?" The direct question seemed to momentarily destabilize the housekeeper's mask of efficiency. Something vulnerable and genuine showed in her eyes. "What bothers me is seeing Gregory suffer again," she answered with unexpected sincerity. "You weren't here after the accident. You didn't see what I saw. He nearly destroyed himself completely. He rebuilt himself by creating this structure, this order. And now you arrive and destabilize everything, make him believe in miracles that—" "I'm not promising miracles," Louise interrupted gently. "I'm just showing that there are more ways to care, to communicate, to be present." Marlene adjusted her pearl necklace, a gesture Louise had already identified as a sign of nervousness. "You're young, full of ideals. You think love and dedication are enough to fix. What's broken?" Her eyes turned to Peter. "But some things once broken cannot be repaired, and it's cruel to let someone believe otherwise." Before Louise could respond, the monitor connected to Peter emitted an alert. The vital signs that had been stable now showed worrying changes, not just the return of the fever, but also drops in oxygen saturation and changes in blood pressure. "Call the doctor. Now," Louise ordered, immediately checking Peter's airway. The alarms drew Gregory back into the room, his face still wet from a quick shower. "What's happening?" "He's having a reaction," Louise explained as she adjusted the oxygen. "It could be to the antibiotic or a worsening of the infection." Dr. Bennett arrived in minutes, accompanied by 2 nurses. The quiet room transformed again into a scene of controlled emergency, with equipment being adjusted and orders given in a precise technical voice. "We need to transfer him to the hospital," the doctor decided after assessing the situation. "The facilities here are excellent, but a full ICU would be more appropriate right now." "The hospital?" Gregory repeated, paling visibly. "But the setup we built here—" "It's impressive, but it doesn't replace a full medical center," the doctor explained as he prepared the transfer paperwork. "It's just a precautionary measure, Mr. Sinclair. With advanced support, we can better control this reaction and identify the precise cause." As the team mobilized for the transfer, Gregory seemed lost, as if the meticulous control he had built was crumbling before his eyes. Louise approached him, speaking in a low voice. "He's going to be fine. I can accompany him to the hospital, if you'll allow it." Gregory looked at her for a moment, then nodded silently. That simple gesture was the final acknowledgement that he could no longer pretend to control everything, that he needed to trust someone other than himself, and that, against all odds, that person was the woman who had challenged every protocol he had established. On the other side of the room, Marlene watched the scene with narrowed eyes. As everyone focused on Peter and the transfer preparations, she discreetly approached the table where Louise had left her purse. With a swift, precise movement, she checked its contents, her eyes glinting when she found a small vial of medication. She quickly took a photo with her phone before putting everything back exactly as it was. St. Luke's Hospital. In Stamford, Connecticut, an hour's drive from the Sinclair mansion, was a modern structure that contrasted with the traditional architecture of the Adirondacks. Wide corridors, light-toned walls, and state-of-the-art technology created an environment that, while welcoming by hospital standards, still carried the characteristic impersonality of medical institutions. Peter was settled in a private room in the special pediatric wing, a concession made after Gregory mobilized his network of contacts to ensure the best possible care. The hospital's medical team, initially intimidated by the entrepreneur's presence and the sophisticated equipment accompanying the patient, soon established an efficient, professional routine. 3 days passed since his admission. The infection, identified as a resistant bacterial pneumonia, was being fought with potent antibiotics following sensitivity tests. His vital signs had stabilized, but Peter remained in a state even more withdrawn than usual. He showed none of the small responses Louise had documented in recent weeks, not even the discrete eye movements or changes in breathing. On Thursday afternoon, Gregory sat by his son's bed, working on his laptop, while occasionally glancing up to check the monitors. He had set up a makeshift office in the hospital room, refusing to leave except for basic necessities. Louise entered, bringing him a coffee. "The doctors just came by. The fever is completely under control now, and the tests show the infection is responding well to the treatment." "When can we take him back home?" Gregory asked, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Dr. Santos wants to keep him under observation for another 48 hours to ensure there's no relapse." Louise sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. "It's standard protocol for cases like Peter's." Gregory nodded, an ironic smile on his lips. "Protocols. Seems I can't escape them, can I?" The self-deprecating comment surprised Louise, who rarely saw the entrepreneur make any kind of joke. Before she could reply, her phone vibrated with a message. "It's Raphael," she explained after checking the screen, "asking how things are here and letting me know the mansion is ready for Peter's return." "Marlene must not be enjoying all this commotion," Gregory commented, a slight tone of amusement in his tired voice. "She is dedicated in her own way," Louise replied diplomatically. "Dedicated and extremely territorial," Gregory completed. "I met Marlene when I bought the property in Highland Falls almost 20 years ago. She already worked for the previous owners and practically came with the house. She never questioned my decisions or my methods. Until you arrived." Louise fidgeted with the strap of her bag, suddenly uncomfortable. "I feel like I've caused a disruption to the routine you had established." "The routine needed to be broken," Gregory replied, surprising her again. He looked at Peter, gently adjusting the blanket covering the boy. "You know, when Marianne was pregnant, we promised each other we'd never be the kind of parents who smother their children with rigid expectations, who impose discipline over affection. And look at me now." I turned. Our home into a hospital, and my son into a clinical project. The confession, so raw and honest, created a moment of unexpected intimacy. Louise realized that, perhaps for the first time since she started working at the mansion, she was truly getting to know Gregory Sinclair, the man behind the businessman and the distant father. "You were trying to protect him the only way you knew how," she offered softly. "I was trying to protect myself," Gregory corrected, his voice almost a whisper. "From the guilt, the fear, the helplessness." He paused, his eyes fixed on his son. "The night of the accident," we argued, "Marianne wanted to cancel our trip to New York City because Peter had a slight cold. I insisted we couldn't postpone the meeting with the foreign investors. I said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." His voice faltered for a moment. "We were arguing when the car skidded in Eagles Pass." The silence that followed was dense, heavy with a pain that was finally finding words. Louise said nothing, understanding that any comment would be inadequate in the face of such an intimate revelation. "After Marianne was gone and Peter," Gregory couldn't finish the sentence. "After the accident, I promised myself I would do everything scientifically possible to help him. I hired the best specialists, bought the most advanced equipment, followed every protocol to the letter. I thought that would compensate, that it would somehow repair what I had broken." "The accident wasn't your fault," Louise said finally. "No?" Gregory looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion and suppressed emotion. "I was driving. I insisted on the trip. I was arguing instead of paying attention to the wet road." Before Louise could respond, a knock on the door interrupted the conversation. A nurse entered to check Peter's vital signs and administer the next dose of antibiotics. Gregory's moment of vulnerability quickly dissipated, replaced by the mask of efficiency and control he wore like armor. When the nurse left, Gregory turned his attention back to his laptop, clearly ending the conversation. Louise respected his retreat, understanding there were limits to how much he could expose himself at once. Night fell, bringing that characteristic quiet of hospitals after visiting hours. Louise had insisted that Gregory rest on the small sofa in the room while she watched over Peter. After much resistance, the entrepreneur finally succumbed to accumulated fatigue and fell asleep, still wearing his impeccable suit with only his tie loosened. Taking advantage of the relative privacy, Louise approached Peter's bed, not to check monitors or adjust medications, but simply to be present, as she did during her sessions at the mansion. "Hi, Peter," she whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the equipment. "I know you're in there, even when all the machines say otherwise. And I know you're scared by all of this, the hospital, the different machines, the new faces." She gently brushed a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. "But everything's okay now. The infection is under control and soon we'll be going home. And you know what else? Your dad is really here this time, not just physically, but truly present." In the corner of the room, Gregory had awakened but remained still, listening to Louise's words without revealing he was awake. "He's trying, Peter," she continued, unaware of her silent audience. "He's trying in a way he maybe never knew how to before. Different people express love in different ways. Some with words and hugs, others with protection and practical care. Your dad thinks he failed. Hugh, but really, he just didn't know how to show what he felt in any way other than control and planning. She paused, observing Peter's serene face. You know, the first thing I noticed when I entered your house was how impeccable, efficient, and organized everything was. But it lacked life, Peter. And it wasn't because you were silent. It was because everyone was trapped in such a rigid routine that they were afraid to even breathe out of turn. A soft smile appeared on her face. But that's changing. You're changing that, without even saying a word. On the sofa, Gregory closed his eyes, feeling a lump in his throat he hadn't experienced since Marianne's funeral. Louise's words were penetrating the defenses he had meticulously built around his heart. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Louise's phone. She quickly answered it so as not to wake Gregory, not realizing he was already awake. "Hello? Mrs. Marlene?" Her tone revealed surprise. The housekeeper rarely contacted her directly. "Yes, he's stable. The doctors are optimistic about his return home in a few days." Louise frowned, listening intently to what the housekeeper was saying on the other end of the line. Her expression gradually changed to shock and then indignation. "That's absurd. I would never... How could you suggest... No, I'm not just going to leave in the middle of the night. Peter needs..." She stopped, apparently interrupted. "I understand. Yes, he's here. No, he's sleeping. I'll talk to him in the morning." When she hung up, the color had drained from her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she put the phone back in her bag. "Is there a problem?" Gregory's voice startled her. She turned to find him sitting up on the sofa, obviously having been awake for, some time. "I didn't know you were awake," she said, trying to compose herself. "What did Marlene want at this hour?" He checked his watch. It was past 11 at night. Louise hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. She had some concerns about Peter's situation. What situation specifically? Gregory's voice took on the incisive tone he used in difficult negotiations. "Please, be direct, Louise." Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze. "Mrs. Marlene found medication in my bag, an anti-anxiety drug I use occasionally for panic attacks. She's suggesting that I gave something to Peter without authorization." "What?" Gregory stood up, now fully alert. "She's insinuating you caused his reaction, the pneumonia." "Apparently." Louise kept her voice low, conscious that they were in a hospital. "She said she spoke with Dr. Bennett, who apparently confirmed that certain substances could provoke similar symptoms." Gregory ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture that revealed extreme agitation. "That's absurd. She wants me to leave the case, immediately." Louise looked at Peter, anguish evident on her face. "She said she has already consulted lawyers about possible legal implications." A heavy silence fell over the room. Louise expected an explosion of anger, sharp questions, perhaps even an immediate dismissal. Marlene was, after all, a long-trusted employee. "How long did you work with children before coming to my house?" Gregory finally asked, his voice surprisingly calm. The question caught her off guard. 8 years. I started as a nursing assistant in a pediatric hospital in Albany, then specialized in long-term care for children with special needs." "And why did you choose that path?" Louise frowned, confused by the direction of the conversation. My younger sister had cerebral palsy. I grew up learning to communicate with someone the world considered incommunicable. After she..." Louise paused, choosing her words carefully. After she passed, I realized I could use what I learned to help other families." Gregory nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "When you arrived at my house, you talked about music, about the things that made Peter smile before the accident. How did you know that?" "I did my research," she replied simply. "I read the medical history, yes, but I also spoke with the gardener, with the driver who worked for the family at the time, even with the music teacher who gave Peter lessons. I wanted to know. The boy, not just the patient." Gregory watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to Louise's complete surprise, he smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Do you know what my biggest mistake as a father was, Louise? Thinking I could replace love with efficiency. He turned his gaze to Peter. And now Marlene is doing the exact same thing, replacing loyalty with control. You don't believe her accusations? If I did, you wouldn't be in this room anymore. He approached his son's bed. I know jealousy and fear when I see them, even when they're disguised as concern. The relief Louise felt was so intense, she had to lean on the edge of the bed to keep from stumbling. Thank you for trusting me. It's not just trust, Gregory replied, his gaze still on Peter. It's recognition. You see my son when everyone, myself included, only saw a patient, and that's worth more than 15 years of loyalty based on efficiency and control. Before Louise could answer, something extraordinary happened. A tear, single, silent, almost imperceptible, slid from the corner of Peter's eye. It wasn't an automatic physiological reaction like tearing from an irritant. It was a tear of emotional origin, laden with meaning. Gregory, Louise whispered, her voice trembling, look. The entrepreneur followed her gaze and froze when he saw the small, wet trail on his son's face. Instinctively, he touched Peter's face with a gentleness that completely contradicted his usual rigid demeanor. Peter, he called, his voice barely audible. Son, can you hear us? The heart monitor registered a slight change in rhythm, nothing alarming, just a gentle acceleration, like that of someone reacting to an emotional stimulus. He's responding, Louise confirmed, checking the other signs. It's not an involuntary reaction or an autonomic reflex. It's conscious, Gregory. He's there. In that moment, something that had been frozen inside Gregory since the accident finally began to thaw. Tears he had suppressed for nearly 2 years welled up in his eyes, and for the first time since the tragedy, he allowed himself to cry openly in front of his son. I'm sorry, son, he whispered, gently holding Peter's limp hand. I'm sorry for not being truly here when you needed me most. Louise quietly stepped back, giving father and son a moment of privacy that had been postponed for far too long. In the hospital corridor, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, processing what she had just witnessed. Not just Peter's tear, which confirmed her persistent belief that the boy was conscious behind his apparent inertia, but also Gregory's transformation, as he finally seemed to have found his way back to his most important role, not that of an efficient crisis manager, but simply that of a father. Her phone vibrated again, another message from Marlene. This time it wasn't an accusation, but a direct ultimatum. Mr. Sinclair needs to choose between his son's safety and his feelings. I will be at the hospital in the morning with Dr. Bennett for a definitive conversation. Louise put the phone away without replying. Marlene's threats, which had once shaken her, now seemed distant and hollow. What mattered was happening in that hospital room, a father and son reconnecting in a silent dialogue, more eloquent than any words. The morning arrived at St. Luke's Hospital with the particular clarity of the Connecticut landscape, different from the light filtered by the constant mist of the Adirondacks. Gregory, who had slept for a few hours in the armchair beside Peter's bed, awoke to the soft sound of a familiar melody. He opened his eyes, to find Louise sitting near the window with a small guitar on her lap, gently strumming a song he recognized immediately, the one Marianne used to sing to Peter at bedtime. Where did you get that? He asked, his voice still hoarse with sleep. Louise stopped the melody with a smile. Raphael brought it when he came to drop off clean clothes for Peter. He found it in the mansion's storage room. I thought it might help. Gregory looked at the small instrument, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. It was from Marianne's collection. She was teaching Peter to play before the accident. I thought it might be something like that, Louise replied, carefully placing the guitar beside the chair. Peter always responded more intensely to folk melodies. The body has a memory, even when the mind seems distant. The entrepreneur stood up, stretching the sore muscles from a night in the uncomfortable armchair. He approached his son's bed, studying his face as if trying to decipher a text in an unknown language. Do you think he really hears us? Understands what we're saying? Louise joined him by the bed. I believe so. The reactions are subtle but consistent. His breathing rhythm changes with certain songs. His eyes sometimes follow movements the tear last night. She paused. Neuroscience is discovering that consciousness is much more complex than we imagined. Patients in states like Peter's often report, after recovery, that they were aware of everything around them, just unable to respond. Like those cases of locked-in syndrome? Gregory asked, revealing he had researched the topic. Similar, yes, though in Peter's case it's more complex due to the associated emotional trauma. Louise gently adjusted the sheet covering the boy. I believe he built an inner refuge after the trauma. It's not just a physical issue, but a psychological protective response. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Santos, the neurologist who had taken over Peter's case at the hospital, entered with his team for the morning rounds. Good morning, Mr. Sinclair, the doctor greeted with cordial professionalism. The tests show significant improvement in the lung infection. The fever hasn't returned in the last 36 hours, and the inflammatory markers are normalizing. And what about last night's event? Gregory asked, referring to Peter's tear. The doctor consulted the digital chart on his tablet. The night shift nurses did report subtle changes. In response patterns, yes. Nothing statistically significant, but... He paused, looking at Gregory and Louise. I must admit the team noted a change in brain activity during the period you reported the emotional response. Gregory's heart quickened. So you confirm it was a conscious response? Medicine has limits to what we can state with certainty, the doctor replied cautiously. But I am willing to consider that there is a higher level of consciousness than standard protocols can measure. He smiled slightly. Sometimes parents and close caregivers notice things our equipment doesn't pick up. The statement, coming from a traditional doctor, was a small but significant victory. Gregory nodded, feeling an unexpected gratitude for the specialist's scientific humility. When can we take him home? If his parameters remain stable, tomorrow morning. We've prepared a follow-up protocol that includes more intensive respiratory physical therapy in the coming weeks, as well as recommendations for controlled sensory stimulation. The doctor glanced briefly at Louise. I've noticed you have been incorporating music and other stimuli into his treatment. I'd like to include these approaches in the formal plan, if you agree. The professional validation made Louise smile discreetly. That would be wonderful, doctor. After the routine exams and medication adjustments, the medical team left, leaving Gregory and Louise alone with Peter once more. The silence that settled was comfortable, unlike the tension that had characterized their first interactions. You know, Gregory commented as he watched his son, when I hired you, I was just expecting another competent professional to follow the protocols I'd established. I never imagined I'd end up questioning everything I thought I knew about caring for Peter. Sometimes we need an outside perspective to see what's right in front of us, Louise replied. You built an impressive structure for his physical well-being. I just helped to remember that there's more to care than technical procedures. The moment was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Mrs. Marlene, accompanied by Dr. Bennett. The contrast between their tense faces and the serene atmosphere that had settled in the room was almost palpable. Mr. Sinclair, Marlene greeted with exaggerated formality. I came as soon as I heard Peter would be discharged tomorrow. We need to discuss the arrangements for his return to the mansion. Gregory immediately realized the housekeeper had been informed by the medical staff, likely after persistently calling the hospital all morning. Good morning. Marlene, Dr. Bennett, I wasn't expecting you today. The situation demands exceptional measures, the doctor replied, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes avoided Louise, as if the silent accusation hanging in the air were a physical thing that could be dodged with a glance. May we speak in private? Marlene requested, casting a significant look at Louise. Any matter related to Peter's care can be discussed in the presence of Miss Clark, Gregory answered firmly. She is now a fundamental part of his care team. The explicit declaration of trust made Marlene's expression visibly harden. She adjusted her pearl necklace, a gesture Gregory now also recognized as a sign of nervousness. In that case, I'll be direct, the housekeeper said, pulling an envelope from her purse. I have documentation here that raises serious questions about Miss Clark's suitability to continue caring for Peter. Dr. Bennett has reviewed the evidence and agrees that there are significant concerns. The doctor cleared his throat, visibly uneasy with the role he was being forced to play. Unauthorized medication was found in Miss Clark's purse, and some of the symptoms Peter presented could theoretically be induced by medication I use for occasional anxiety management, legally prescribed for me, Louise interrupted, her voice calm but firm. At no point did I administer any unauthorized substance to Peter. All medications he receives are logged in the system and verified by at least 2 professionals, as determined by the very protocol established by Mr. Sinclair. Gregory observed the situation with a clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. He saw Marlene, a woman who had dedicated her life to maintaining the order and structure of the mansion, desperately trying to preserve the system that had worked for her for so many years. He saw Dr. Bennett, a competent professional, but limited by his strictly clinical view, unable to admit that Peter's progress came precisely from what couldn't be measured in scans or quantified in reports. "The envelope, please," he requested, holding out his hand. Marlene handed him the document with a triumphant glint in her eyes. Gregory opened it slowly, examining its contents: photos of the medication bottle found in Louise's purse, a preliminary report on possible side effects, and, what surprised him most, a letter of dismissal already written in Louise's name, awaiting only his signature. Without a word, Gregory tore the documents in half, then into quarters, and finally into unrecognizable pieces, which he calmly deposited in the trash can beside Peter's bed. "Mr. Sinclair," Marlene exclaimed, shocked, "you don't understand the gravity." "I understand perfectly, Marlene," Gregory interrupted, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "I understand that for nearly 2 years I followed rigid protocols, hired the most renowned specialists, and turned my home into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, and none of it brought my son back. Progress is slow in cases like Peter's," Dr. Bennett tried to argue. "Science has limits that—" "Exactly, Doctor. Science has limits." Gregory approached his son's bed, placing a hand gently on his. "And for 2 years I refused to look beyond those limits. I refused to see my son as anything more than a clinical case to be managed." He took a deep breath before continuing. "That ends today." The silence that followed his declaration was almost tangible. Marlene paled visibly, understanding what was to come. "When we return home tomorrow," Gregory continued, "there will be significant changes. Miss Clark will continue to care for Peter, with the authority to implement approaches complementary to traditional medical therapies. Dr. Bennett, your contract will be maintained if you are willing to work collaboratively, respecting that there are forms of care beyond your professional scope." The doctor seemed relieved by the conciliatory offer, nodding quickly. "Certainly, Mr. Sinclair. I am open to complementary approaches, as long as they are properly supervised." Gregory then turned to Marlene, his gaze softer than the housekeeper had expected. "As for you, Marlene, I thank you for your 15 years of loyal service. I know that everything you did was motivated by what you believed was best for this family." "It has always been my only concern, sir," she replied, her voice slightly trembling. "I believe that. But I also recognize that profound changes are not always compatible with old structures." He paused meaningfully. "Therefore, I would like you to consider an early retirement with all the benefits your years of dedication deserve. Or, if you prefer, I can help you find a position at another property where your experience and methods would be more aligned with the owner's expectations." The proposal, though presented with respect, was unequivocally a dismissal. Marlene stood tall, her pride sustaining her posture, even as her eyes revealed the emotional impact of his words. "I understand, Mr. Sinclair. I will prepare for my departure for when you and young Peter return to the mansion." "There's no rush, Marlene," Gregory replied, genuinely grateful for her years of service, despite their recent conflict. "Take the time you need to organize your transition." When Marlene and Dr. Bennett had left, a contemplative silence filled the room. Louise seemed both relieved and slightly stunned by the swiftness of the changes. "Are you sure about all of this?" she finally asked. Gregory returned to the chair beside Peter's bed, exhausted by the emotional confrontation, but strangely at peace with his decisions. for the first time in a long time. I'm sure of something, Louise. I can't keep pretending that efficiency and control are substitutes for what Peter really needs. And what do you think he needs? Louise asked softly. His father back, Gregory answered simply. Not a crisis manager, not a financier of treatments, just his dad. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Peter, who had remained motionless throughout the confrontation, moved his fingers slightly. A small, almost imperceptible, but undeniably voluntary movement, as if responding directly to his father's words. Gregory froze, his eyes fixed on his son's hand. "Did you see that?" Louise nodded, equally amazed. "I did. Try talking to him again." "Peter," Gregory called, leaning closer. "Son, are you there? If you can hear me, if you can somehow respond." His voice broke with emotion, the movement repeated, a slight flexing of the fingers, as if Peter were trying to reach for his father's hand holding his. It was not an involuntary muscle contraction or a reflex spasm. It was a movement with purpose, filled with intention. "My God," Gregory whispered, tears now streaming freely. "He's coming back, isn't he?" "He was always here," Louise replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Just waiting for us to find the way to him." The days that followed transformed the Sinclair mansion in a way that not even the most optimistic observer could have predicted. Peter's return home was marked not by the resumption of an impersonal clinical routine, but by the beginning of something entirely new. The first change was physical. Gregory ordered all non-essential medical equipment to be removed from his son's room, replacing the hospital-like environment with a space that gradually regained the personality of a teenager's bedroom. Posters of favorite bands, adventure books, and even the old video game console reappeared, creating an atmosphere that spoke more of life than survival. The second change was in the staff. Marlene, true to her word, left discreetly a week after their return, leaving behind a house she had managed with military precision for 15 years. Raphael was promoted to coordinator of the small care team, which now operated under a completely different philosophy. Dr. Bennett, surprisingly adaptable when necessary, adjusted his protocols to incorporate the more holistic approaches he had once dismissed. But the most profound change happened in Gregory. The entrepreneur who once delegated his son's care to professionals while burying himself in work now organized his schedule around Peter. Every morning before his video conferences, he spent at least an hour with his son, reading, talking about the day's plans, or simply being present. In the afternoons, he often cancelled appointments to attend physical or music therapy sessions, observing every small sign of progress with a pride he had never allowed himself to feel before. On a particularly sunny December afternoon, when the warmth finally overcame the typical Adirondack mist, Gregory and Louise were with Peter in the conservatory. The boy, now more responsive, could maintain eye contact and answer simple questions with small finger movements, one for yes, two for no. Louise played the melody that Peter and Marianne used to share on the small guitar, while Gregory told stories about his mother, something he had never been able to do in the previous 2 years. "Your mother had a laugh that could fill any room," he narrated, sitting beside his son's chair. "Even people in a bad mood couldn't resist when she started laughing. It was like music." Peter kept his eyes fixed on his father, absorbing every word, every facial expression. His fingers occasionally moved as if trying to participate in the conversation in his own, limited way. "She dreamed of seeing you play the guitar in a school recital," Gregory continued. "She said you had a musical ear, just like her." He paused, looking at Louise, who continued to strum the instrument softly. "I think when you're stronger, we can start lessons again. What do you think, son? One movement for yes." After a moment of visible concentration, Peter managed to move his index finger, a clear and decisive yes. Gregory smiled, still marveling at every response, no matter how small. Louise stopped the music, observing the interaction with the serene joy that had become her trademark at the mansion. "He's more and more present," she commented. "The occupational therapist mentioned that the strength in his fingers has increased significantly in the last few weeks. Do you think he might—" Gregory hesitated, still wary of nurturing hopes that were too high. Regain more function, Louise completed. Every case is unique, but we've already seen progress beyond what any specialist predicted. The brain has incredible plasticity, especially in young people. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Peter, concentrating visibly, moved not just his fingers, but tried to articulate a sound. The effort was evident on his face, a determination that Gregory immediately recognized as an inheritance from Marianne. "He's trying to talk," Gregory whispered, leaning closer. "What is it, son? What are you trying to say?" Peter took a deep breath, focusing all his energy on what seemed to be a monumental task. His lips moved once, twice, until finally, with an effort that showed in every feature of his face, a sound emerged, hoarse, fragile, almost inaudible, but unmistakably intentional. Dad. The word, so simple and yet so profoundly meaningful, hit Gregory like a physical wave. He froze, unable to believe what he had just heard. "Peter, did you say Dad?" the boy repeated, his voice a little stronger this time, as if the first attempt had cleared a long-blocked path. Gregory looked at Louise, tears in his eyes, seeking confirmation that he wasn't imagining things. Her radiant and equally emotional smile confirmed that the miracle was real. "I'm here, son," he finally replied, holding Peter's hand gently. "I'm right here." That moment in the garden marked not the end of a journey, but the true beginning of a new one. In the months that followed, Peter continued to progress, slowly with occasional setbacks, but always moving forward. His vocabulary gradually expanded from one word to short phrases. The mobility in his arms improved, though his legs remained paralyzed. Each small victory was celebrated not as a milestone in a medical protocol, but as a step on a shared journey. The mansion, once a monument to clinical efficiency, became a true home, vibrant, sometimes messy, filled with music and voices. The staff who once moved silently through the halls now chatted freely. The curtains remained open, allowing natural light to flood every room. One evening in May of the following year, as the temperatures began to drop, heralding the mountain winter, Gregory found Louise on the porch, watching the stars that were particularly bright on that mist-free night. "Peter's finally asleep," he commented, joining her at the railing. "He insisted on finishing the chapter in his book first." Louise smiled. "Was he always this stubborn?" "Just like his mother," Gregory replied, the smile revealing that the memory of Marianne now brought more comfort than pain. "Determined to the end." They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the starry sky. The relationship between them had transformed over the months, from the initial tension between employer and employee to a partnership, based on mutual respect and a shared goal. And gradually, something more that neither of them had actively sought, but which had grown naturally in the fertile ground of the transformation they had witnessed together. "I received an offer," Louise commented, finally breaking the silence. "A hospital in New York City is creating a humanized care program for children with neurological trauma. They want me to help structure the approach." Gregory felt a tightness in his chest. "Are you going to accept?" "I haven't decided yet," she answered honestly. "The work is important. It could help many families, but—" Her eyes met Gregory's. "There are reasons to stay too." "Peter would need you very much," Gregory replied, aware that he wasn't just talking about his son. "Peter is becoming more and more independent," Louise smiled, "thanks to a father who finally found his way. Thanks to a woman who showed us that not everything that's broken needs to be fixed in the same way," Gregory corrected gently. "There are other reasons for you to stay, Louise, reasons that have nothing to do with your job as a caregiver." The look they shared held questions and possibilities that both had been carefully avoiding naming in recent months. "I don't want you to give up an important opportunity," Gregory continued, "but I want you to know that this house, that we, wouldn't be the same without you." Louise covered his hand with hers on the railing. "Maybe it doesn't have to be a choice between leaving and staying. The hospital is only a couple of hours from here. I could work a few days there, and others—" "Here," Gregory completed, intertwining his fingers with hers, "where we started something that is still far from over." The sound of the porch door opening interrupted the moment. Peter appeared in his motorized wheelchair, which he could now control with growing skill. "I found you," he said, his voice still hesitant but increasingly clear. "I want to see the stars too." Gregory and Louise exchanged knowing glances before making room for Peter to join them at the railing. The three of them stood there, contemplating the Highland Falls night sky. No longer a broken family and a stranger, but something new and whole that they had built together, word by word, gesture by gesture, day by day. "Look," Peter pointed to a particularly bright star. "The strongest one of all." "Like you," Gregory replied, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Like us," Peter corrected, his hand reaching for Louise's on the other side. And in that moment, under the starry mountain sky, the mansion that had once been just a cold, efficient structure had finally become what it was always meant to be. A home where silence was no longer an absence, but just a different form of dialogue, and where true healing came not from protocols and technologies, but from the courage to remain present, even when everything seems irreparably lost. End of story, dear listeners. We hope the journey of Gregory, Peter, and Louise has touched your hearts. To continue experiencing emotions like this, we've prepared a special playlist with other stories that explore the bonds that make us human. Find it by clicking the link on the side. If this narrative about healing, presence, and new beginnings resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Every day, we bring you stories that celebrate our ability to be reborn from the most challenging situations. Until next time.